A soldier, barely a man, takes cover in a flooded rice paddy, the sound of gunfire echoing in the humid air. Half a world away, a university student chants, his face illuminated by the flames of a burning draft card. In the White House, a president looks into a television camera and promises victory is just around the corner. On a makeshift stage, a guitar strums a song of rebellion that becomes the anthem for a generation. And at a dinner table in suburban Ohio, a family sits in a silence thick with unspoken anger, a chasm of belief separating a father from his son. How did it come to this? How did a war fought in a distant, unfamiliar land tear the United States of America apart from the inside out? This is the story of how the Vietnam War became so much more than a military conflict. It became a civil war of values, a battle for the very soul of the nation that pitted neighbor against neighbor, parent against child, and the government against its own people. It was a war that didn't just leave casualties on the battlefield. It left a wound in the heart of America, a deep and painful division that in many ways has yet to fully heal. To understand how this war fractured a nation, we have to go back to a time before the first shots were fired in Vietnam, to the end of World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union, once allies, were now locked in a global struggle for ideological supremacy, the Cold War. American foreign policy became obsessed with a single overriding fear, the spread of communism. This fear was distilled into a simple, terrifying idea called the domino theory. If one country in a region fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably topple as well, like a row of dominoes. Southeast Asia, and Vietnam in particular, became the place where President Dwight D. Eisenhower and his successors decided America had to draw the line. After French colonialists were defeated by Vietnamese nationalists, Vietnam was split in two: a communist North and a non-communist, American-backed South. The United States poured money, equipment, and eventually military advisors into propping up the struggling South Vietnamese government. For most Americans in the late 1950s and early 1960s, Vietnam was just a footnote, a faraway place with a hard-to-pronounce name. The consensus was clear: communism was a threat, and America's job was to contain it. But the seeds of division were already being planted. The U.S. was backing a South Vietnamese leader, Ngo Dinh Diem, whose regime was corrupt, brutal, and deeply unpopular with its own people. Reports trickled back about a government with little real support and a shadowy enemy, the Viet Cong, that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. The moment that changed everything, the incident that turned a limited engagement into a full-scale American war, came in August 1964. The official story was that North Vietnamese patrol boats launched an unprovoked attack on a U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, in a body of water called the Gulf of Tonkin. A second attack was reported 2 days later. President Lyndon B. Johnson, addressing the nation, spoke of open aggression on the high seas. In a climate of fear and patriotism, Congress overwhelmingly passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It gave President Johnson sweeping authority to use military force in Vietnam without an official declaration of war. America was going all in. But even then, the story was murky. Questions were raised almost immediately about that second alleged attack, with some evidence suggesting it never even happened. It was the first, and perhaps most critical, lie in a long series of them. The American government had presented a simple story of good versus evil, but the reality was far more complicated. With the stroke of a pen, the stage was set not just for a massive escalation of the war, but for a catastrophic collapse of trust between the American people and their leaders. As President Johnson dramatically increased the U.S. military presence, sending the first official combat troops in 1965, the war began to demand more than just money and machines. It demanded bodies, young American men, and it got them through the draft. The military draft, or conscription, brought the war home in the most personal way imaginable. During the Vietnam era, 2.2 million men were drafted from an eligible pool of 27 million. Suddenly, the war wasn't some abstract foreign policy debate. It was a letter in the mail, a summons that could pull a son, brother, or husband from his life and send him halfway around the world to fight and possibly die. The draft quickly became a lightning rod for outrage, seen as a glaring symbol of the war's unfairness. The system was full of loopholes and deferments. If you were enrolled in college, for instance, you could get a 2S deferment and put off service. This created a stark class divide. It meant that the sons of the wealthy and middle class, who were far more likely to go to college, were shielded from the conflict, while young men from poor and working-class families were sent into combat in disproportionate numbers. The very system designed to supply soldiers for a national cause was seen as deeply discriminatory, fueling the bitter charge that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. This resentment ignited a firestorm of protest, the likes of which America had never seen. The anti-war movement started small, with teach-ins on college campuses like the one at the University of Michigan in 1965. But as troop numbers swelled and casualty lists grew, the movement exploded. It went from peaceful pickets to massive national demonstrations that drew hundreds of thousands to Washington, D.C. and other cities. For the baby boomers, the war became the defining issue of their generation. They saw it as an unjust, immoral, and imperialistic conflict. They burned their draft cards in public acts of defiance, a federal crime, and chanted slogans like, "Hell no, we won't go." This rising anti-war feeling was amplified by a revolutionary new force in American life: television. Vietnam was the first television war, often called the living room war. For the first time, news crews had relatively uncensored access to the front lines. Every night, the networks broadcast visceral color images of the fighting directly into American homes. Viewers saw American soldiers slogging through jungles, villages in flames, and the terrified faces of Vietnamese civilians. The brutal, chaotic, and bloody reality of guerrilla warfare stood in stark contrast to the optimistic reports coming from Washington. This disconnect created what became known as the credibility gap. Military leaders in Saigon would hold daily press briefings, sarcastically nicknamed the 5 o'clock follies, where they would present statistics and body counts that painted a picture of steady progress. President Johnson and his officials kept assuring the public that there was light at the end of the tunnel. But the images on the nightly news told a very different story. The credibility gap was the chasm between what Americans were being told by their government and what they were seeing with their own eyes. That gap became an unbridgeable canyon during the Tet Offensive in January 1968. In a massive, coordinated surprise attack, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces struck cities and military bases all across South Vietnam. Militarily, Tet was a disaster for the communists. They suffered devastating losses. But psychologically, it was a catastrophic defeat for the United States. The sheer scale of the offensive shattered the official story that the enemy was weak and on the verge of collapse. Americans, who'd been told for months the war was almost won, watched in horror as Viet Cong commandos breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The message was unmistakable: the government had not been telling the truth. Public support for the war plummeted. The anti-war movement soon merged with a broader cultural rebellion, the counterculture. For many young people, opposing the war was part of rejecting the entire establishment, the values, social norms, and authority of their parents' generation. This cultural rebellion had its own look: long hair, bell-bottoms, and its own soundtrack. Musicians became powerful voices of protest. Creedence Clearwater Revival's Fortunate Son was a furious takedown of the draft's class bias, while Edwin Starr's War became a chart-topping anthem that asked, "War, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing." This wasn't just a protest. It was a generational earthquake. But it's a profound mistake to think that all of America was marching against the war. For every protester, there was another American who supported it, or who simply felt it was their patriotic duty to support the troops and the government, even if they had doubts. This other America was often less visible in the media, a fact that led President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968, to give them a name. In a famous TV address in November 1969, he appealed to the great silent majority of my fellow Americans for their support. The silent majority was largely made up of older Americans, members of the greatest generation who had won World War II. They tended to be more conservative, deeply patriotic, and terrified of communism. They looked at the student protesters with contempt, seeing them as spoiled, un-American, and disrespectful of the sacrifices soldiers were making overseas. They saw the counterculture not as liberation, but as a slide into chaos and moral rot. This was more than a political disagreement. It was a fundamental clash of values. It split workplaces, communities, and families, sparking bitter arguments over dinner tables across the country. One side saw patriotism in protesting an unjust war. The other saw patriotism in fighting it. By the end of the 1960s, these two Americas were no longer even speaking the same language. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the divisions in America reached a violent, tragic climax. The country felt like it was coming apart at the seams. 1968 had already been one of the most chaotic years in American history. The Tet Offensive shattered public confidence in January. Then in August, all eyes turned to the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Inside, the Democratic Party was fracturing over the war. Outside, thousands of anti-war protesters gathered. The city's mayor, Richard J. Daley, responded with a massive police force, and the situation exploded into what an official investigation later called a police riot. For days, the world watched as Chicago police brutally beat demonstrators and journalists in the streets. The war had truly come home. But the worst was yet to come. In April 1970, President Nixon announced that American forces had invaded Cambodia, a neutral country, to attack North Vietnamese supply lines. To many, this was a shocking escalation, not the peace with honor Nixon had promised. College campuses erupted. At Kent State University in Ohio, a public university in the nation's heartland, the protests grew tense. The governor called in the Ohio National Guard. On May 4, 1970, during a protest on campus, a group of guardsmen turned and fired a volley of shots into a crowd of unarmed students. In 13 seconds, 4 students were killed and 9 were wounded. The Kent State shootings sent a shockwave across the nation. It was a moment of profound horror. American soldiers killing American students on a college campus. The event triggered a massive student strike, shutting down hundreds of universities across the country. But the reaction also exposed just how deep the nation's division had become. A Gallup poll taken shortly after the shootings found that 58% of Americans blamed the students for what happened. Many in the silent majority sided with the forces of law and order, viewing the students as radical troublemakers who got what they deserved. The incident laid bare the bitter hatred that now defined the two sides of the American divide. A year later, in June 1971, another bombshell dropped, this time striking the very foundation of the government's credibility. The New York Times began publishing excerpts from a top-secret Department of Defense study that became known as the Pentagon Papers. Leaked by military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, the 7,000-page report was a secret history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. It revealed in stunning detail that a succession of presidents, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy and Johnson, had systematically lied to the American public and to Congress. The papers showed that the government had deliberately misled the country about how and why the U.S. got into the war, hid its plans for escalation, and privately knew the chances for victory were slim, even as it publicly promised success. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the very justification for the war, was shown to be deliberately distorted. The Pentagon Papers were the ultimate proof of what the anti-war movement had been saying for years. The government could not be trusted. The credibility gap was no longer a theory. It was a documented fact. For many Americans who had tried to support their country, the revelations were a final, devastating betrayal. Amid all this turmoil, the personal cost of the war just kept growing. For the soldiers in Vietnam, the experience was grueling. They fought bravely in a brutal war against a determined enemy, often unsure of their mission or why they were even there. Then they came home, not to ticker-tape parades, but to a nation deeply conflicted about their service. Some were met with open hostility from protesters, while many others faced a painful public indifference. They were often ignored, misunderstood, and blamed for a war they didn't start. Many carried deep physical and psychological scars, and the image of the troubled, neglected Vietnam vet became a painful fixture in American culture. The war finally ended for the United States in January 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. The last American combat troops left 2 months later. In 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, and the war was officially over. America had lost. Over 58,000 Americans were killed, and more than 150,000 were wounded. But the casualties couldn't all be counted on a memorial wall. The war left behind a nation that was exhausted, cynical, and profoundly divided. The Vietnam War was a national trauma. It shattered the comfortable consensus of the post-World War II era and fundamentally changed America's relationship with its government, its military, and itself. The conflict helped fuel a cycle of inflation that damaged the economy, and it crippled Lyndon Johnson's Great Society social programs as money and political will were drained away by the war. Politically, it fractured the once dominant Democratic Party and fed a growing public distrust of government that is still with us today. The legacy of that division is all around us. It created the Vietnam Syndrome, a deep reluctance to commit U.S. forces abroad that shaped foreign policy for decades. It led to the end of the military draft and the creation of our modern all-volunteer force, which has created a new kind of gap between the military and civilian society. It spurred the passage of the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 with the simple, powerful logic that if you were old enough to be drafted to fight, you were old enough to vote. But perhaps the deepest scar was cultural. The war dissolved the simple, confident patriotism of a previous generation and replaced it with a deep-seated cynicism. It taught a generation to question authority and challenge the official story. The divisions it carved into the country, between liberal and conservative, young and old, protester and patriot, became permanent fixtures in the American landscape. Decades later, Americans are still split over the war's meaning and morality. The war in Vietnam may have ended in 1975, but the war over Vietnam, the battle for its meaning and its memory, continues in the heart of a nation still grappling with the ghosts of its most divisive conflict.